Alrighty, welcome back to another installment of Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fraggeth, and today we're going to be reading more of The Jesus Incident by Frank Herbert and Bill Ransom. My apologies in advance, this is going to be pretty low energy. I've got some nasty stomach bug. Um, it's also probably going to be short. Um, we'll see. I do not wish to worship the porcelain god. Um, during the stream, if at all possible. I'm in a good moment right now, but earlier was not great. Um, so, previously on, Bill Ransom and Frank Herbert just threw us right on in there. There's a tiny, brief summary. I forgot to go and get the maps again. Oh well. There's a tiny, brief summary, roughly, of Destination Void. Um, and then we're just kind of thrown right into it. We actually open with Raja Flattery, of all people, waking up in a hive. And, well, he's being woken up by Ship. Me too, Derpy Shark, thank you. That's the hope. Um, I don't know I don't know where it came from. I ate the same food as a bunch of other people, and everybody else was fine. So I'm just like, "Arr." uh, anyway. So Raja Flattery is being woken up. We're introduced to a pretty large cast of characters, um, including Morgan Oakes, who is the CP, chaplain psychiatrist, who's hanging out on Ship and feels that Ship is trying to kill him, possibly, or poison him, or otherwise make his life difficult. Um, we've got Caro Peniel and Hallie Eckel, who are a loving couple. Caro Peniel is a poet. He is apparently in communication with Ship. He talks to Ship. Ship is with a capital S, by the way. Hallie Eckel very much wants to jump his bones. She likes him a lot, and they like each other a lot, and they are already allowed to be a breeding pair, and that's great. But Caro Peniel is like, I kind of have other things I want to do. Um, it's not you, it's me, honey, sort of thing. He wants the time to be right, I guess. We are also introduced to Winslow Ferry, who's a kind of a nasty drunk middleman. Um, So Caro Peniel actually is getting shipped down to the colony on Pandora, which we've learned a little bit about. Um, Pandora is pretty inhospitable, other than the fact that we can live there. Um, all of the local flora and fauna is basically anathema to our existence. It does not play nice. We haven't even really been introduced to the nerve runners yet. We've heard them talked about in hushed quavering tones. But there are nerve runners, and we're going to learn more about them, and they're not very pleasant. We've also heard something about kelp, electro kelp or electro kelp. It's apostrophe L, ectro kelp, as in electrical kelp. We know it does something with lights, and it causes hallucinations, and it may or may not be sentient. If this sounds familiar, that's because you've probably heard of Solaris by Stanislaw Lem. Um, this is different. This is going to be pretty different than that, though. This goes in a pretty different direction. Um, highly recommend that, by the way. I recommend Stanislaw Lem in general. That guy, oh my goodness. That guy is so influential, you have no idea. You have no idea until you start reading some Stanislaw Lem, and you're like, holy crap, this guy really did have every idea. Um, he's he's kind of the example of oh, what's the way that Terry Pratchett put it? That ideas kind of just whiz through the universe, but some people are kind of like local nexuses or a vortex that sucks ideas in, um, and is constantly shooting them out into the world, or they always have ideas. And he's an example thereof. He's pretty great. Highly recommend, particularly if you want to get into Eastern European science fiction. He's foundational. Highly recommended. Um, we've also been introduced to Wheela Taulini, and that's Waela space capital Tao lower capital Lini. Wheela Taulini. She's going to become important later. Suffice it to say, she's tall. She has color changing skin that changes like kind of a mood bracelet sort of thing. Um, and she's kind of a badass. She's pretty good at her job, which is watching the perimeter to make sure the local fauna doesn't get into where the people are. Um, so as far as actual plot thrust, other than being introduced to tons of characters, as far as plot thrust is concerned, um, Ship and Ship kind of broke everything down. Um, kind of lays it all out there in a sort of vague, roundabout way. Um, because Ship being Ship is kind of ineffable. Ship, by the way, is God. Uh, very much so. Ship is doing God things for God reasons. And so he's talking to Raj, and oh, come on here. Let me find the salient part. So apparently, Ship has brought Raj back, this specific Raj Flattery, back repeatedly to do things over the course of who knows how long. Um, many, many instances. And here we go. So, I'm an instrument. Are you replaying me? No, Raj, no. Such sadness in that terrible voice. Instruments play. Why should I permit you to play me? Good, very good, Raj. Is that supposed to be an answer? That was approval. You are indeed my best friend, my favorite instrument. I'll probably never understand that. It's partly because you enjoy the play. Flattery could not suppress it. A chuckle escaped him. Laughter suits you, Raj. There's a paragraph there that we're going to skip. What are we playing this time? My demand remains unfulfilled, Raj. Humans somehow cannot decide how to worship. That's why there are no more humans now. He felt frigid cold all through his body. No more. What have you done? Earth has vanished into the cosmic whirl, Raj. All the Earths are gone. Long time, remember? Now there are only shipmen. And you. Me, human? You are original material. A clone, a doppelganger, original material? Very much so. What are shipmen? They are survivors from the most recent replays, slightly different replays from the Earth which you recall. Not human? You could breed with them. How are they different? They have similar ancestral experiences to yours, but they were picked up at different points in their social development. Flattery sensed confusion in this answer and made a decision not to probe it. Not yet. He wanted to try another tack. What do you mean they were picked up? They thought of it as rescue. In each instance, their son was about to nova. More of your doing? They have been prepared most carefully for your arrival, Raj. How have they been prepared? They have a chaplain psychiatrist who teaches hate. They have Cy Murdoch, who has learned the lesson well. They have a woman named Hamill, whose extraordinary strength goes deeper than anyone suspects. They have an old man named Ferry, who believes everything can be bought. They have Wela, and she is worthy of careful attention. They have a young poet named Caro Peniel, and they have Hallie Eckel, who thinks she wants the poet. They have people who have been cloned and engineered for strange occupations. They have hungers, fears, joys. You call that preparation? Yes, and I call it involvement. Which is what you want from me. Involvement, yes. Give me one compelling reason I should go down there. I do not compel such things. Not a responsive answer, but Flattery knew he would have to accept it. So I'm to arrive. Where and how? There is a planet beneath us. Most shipmen are on that planet. Colonists. And they must decide how they are to warship. You are still perceptive, Raj. What did they say when you put the question to them? I have not put this question to them. That, I hope, will be your task. Flattery shuddered. He knew that game. It was in him to shout a refusal, to rage and invite Ship's worst reprisal. But something in this dialogue held his tongue. What happens if they fail? I break the recording. Which sounds pretty dire for all concerned. Except probably Ship. So Ship has given an ultimatum. Ship is moderately ineffable. He's kind of gone. It has gone through a little bit of implication as to what Ship is all about and what Ship can do. We're going to get more of that later. Ship is something else. Ship is spooky. Um, but anyway, where are we? Oh, yeah, we pick up basically right there, which is several chapters down the road from what I just read, but it's going to pick up on that. So that was an appropriate passage to read. Give me 1 sec here to get some more water in me, which hopefully will stay down for 2 hours, and we'll get cracking. Or an hour and a half, as the case may be. Poetry, like consciousness, drops the insignificant digits. Raja Flattery, Ship Records. Ship's warning that this could be the end of humankind left Flattery with a sense of emptiness. He stared into the blackness which surrounded him, trying to find some relief. Would Ship really break the recording? What did Ship mean by a recording? Last chance. His emotional responses told Flattery he had touched a deep core of affinity with his own kind. The thought that in some faraway future, on a line through infinity, there might be other humans to enjoy life as he had enjoyed it, this thought filled him with warm affections for such descendants. Do you really mean this is our last chance? He asked. Much as it pains me. Ship's response did not surprise him. The words were torn from him. Why don't you just tell us how to... Raj, how much of your free will would you give me? Oh, that's an exclamation point at the end. Raj, how much of your free will would you give me? How much would you take? Believe me, Raj, there are places where neither God nor man dares intervene. And you want me to go down to this planet, put your question to them, and help them answer your demand? Would you do that? Could I refuse? I seek choice, Raj, not compulsion or chance. Will you accept? Flattery thought about this. He could refuse. Why not? What did he owe these shipmen, these replay survivors? But they were sufficiently human that he could interbreed with them. Human. And he still sensed that core of pain when he thought about a universe devoid of humans. One last chance for humankind? It might be interesting play. Or it might be one of Ship's illusions. Is this just is this all is all is all this just illusion, Ship? No. The flesh exists to feel the things that flesh feels. Doubt everything except that. I either doubt everything or nothing. So be it. Will you play despite your doubts? Will you tell me more about this play? If you ask a correct question. What role am I playing? Ah. It was a sigh of beatific grace. You play the living challenge. Flattery knew that role. Living challenge. You made people find the best within themselves, a best which they might not suspect they possessed. But some would be destroyed by such a demand. Remembering the pain of responsibility for such destruction, he wanted to help in his decision, but knew he dared not ask directly. Perhaps if he learned more about Ship's plans. Have you hidden in my memory things about the game that I should know? Raj! There was no mistaking the outrage. It flowed through him as though his body were a sudden sieve thrust beneath a hot cascade. Then, more softly, I do not steal your memories, Raj. Then I'm to be something different, a new factor in this game. What else is different? The place of the test possesses a difference so profound it may test you beyond your capacities, Raj. The many implications of this answer filled him with wonder. So there were things even an all-powerful being did not know, things even God or Satan might learn. Ship made him fearful then by commenting on his unspoken thought. Given that marvelous and perilous condition which you call time, power can be a weakness. Then what's this profound difference which will test me? An element of the game which you must discover for yourself. Flattery saw the pattern of it then. The decision had to be his own, not compulsion. It was the difference between choice and chance. It was the difference between the precision of a holorecord replay and a brand new performance where free will dominated. And the prize was another chance for humankind. The chaplain psychiatrist's manual said, God does not play dice with man. Obviously, someone had been wrong. Very well, Ship. I'll gamble with you. Excellent. And Raj, when the dice roll, there will be no outside interference to control how they fall. He found the phraseology of this promise interesting, but sensed the futility of exploring it. Instead, he asked, Where will we play? On this planet which I call Pandora, a small frivolity. I presume Pandora's box is already open. Indeed, all the evils that can trouble mankind have been released. I've accepted your request. What happens now? For answer, Flattery felt the high blocks release him, the soft restraints pulling away. Light glowed around him, and he recognized a D-Hive laboratory in one of the ship bays. The familiarity of the place dismayed him. He sat up and looked around. All that time, and this lab remained unchanged. But of course, Ship was infinite and infinitely powerful. Nothing outside of time was impossible for Ship. Except getting humankind to decide on their manner of worship. What if we fail this time? Would Ship really break the recording? He felt it in his guts.
Ship would erase them. No more humankind, ever. Ship would go on to new distractions. If we fail, we'll mature without flowering, never to send our seed through infinity. Human evolution will stop here. Have I changed in Hybe? All that time. He slipped out of the tank enclosure and padded across to a full-length mirror set into one of the lab's curved walls. His naked flesh appeared unchanged from the last time he had seen it. His face retained its air of quizzical detachment, an expression others often thought calculating. The remote brown eyes and upraked black eyebrows had been both help and hindrance. Something in the human psyche said such features belonged only to superior creatures. But superiority could be an impossible burden. "Ah, you sense a truth," Ship whispered. Flattery tried to swallow in a dry throat. The mirror told him that his flesh had not aged. Time? He began to grasp what Ship meant by such a length of time which was meaningless. Time, by the way, is capital T. For the last several times they've said the word time, it's been a capital T. I should have pointed that out earlier. Hybe held flesh in stasis no matter what the passage of time. No maturity there. But what about his mind? What about that what about that reflected construct for which his brain was the receiver? He felt that something had ripened in his awareness. "I'm ready. How do I get down to Pandora?" Ship spoke from a vocoder above the mirror.
"There are several ways, transports which I have provided."
"So you deliver me to Pandora. I just walk in on them. Hi, I'm Raja Flattery. I've come to give you a big pain in the head."
"Flippancy does not suit you, Raj."
"I feel your displeasure."
"Do you already regret your decision, Raj?"
"Can you tell me anything more about the problems on Pandora?"
"The most immediate problem is their encounter with an alien intelligence, the Lectrokelp."
"Dangerous?"
"So they believe. The Lectrokelp is close to infinite, and humans fear—"
"Humans fear open spaces, never-ending open spaces. Humans fear their own intelligence because it's close to infinite."
"You delight me, Raj."
A feeling of joy washed over Flattery. It was so rich and powerful that he felt he might dissolve in it. He knew that the sensation did not originate with him, and it left him feeling drained, transparent, bloodless. Flattery pressed the heels of his hands against his tightly closed eyes. What a terrible thing that joy was! That joy was, because when it was gone, when it was gone. He whispered, "Unless you intend to kill me, don't do that again."
"As you choose."
How cold and remote. "I want to be human. That's what I was intended to be."
"If that's the game you seek."
Flattery sensed Ship's disappointment, but this made him defensive, and he turned to questions. "Have shipmen communicated with this alien intelligence, this Lectrokelp?"
"No, they have studied it, but do not understand it."
Flattery took his hands away from his eyes. "Have shipmen ever heard of Raja Flattery?"
"There's a name in the history which I teach them."
"Then I'd better take another name." He ruminated for a moment. Then, "I'll call myself Raja Thomas."
"Excellent."
"Thomas for your doubts, and Raja for your origins." Raja Thomas, communications expert, Ship's best friend. Here I come, ready or not.
"A game. Yes, a game. And, Raj,
What?
for an infinite being, time produces boredom.
Limits exist to how much time I can tolerate." "How much time are you giving us to decide the way we'll warship?"
At the proper moment you will be told. And one more thing.
Yes? Do not be dismayed if I refer to you occasionally as my devil. He was a moment recovering his voice. Then, what can I do about it? You can call me whatever you like. I merely asked that you not be dismayed. Sure, and I'm King Canute telling the tides to stop. There was no response from Ship, and Flattery wondered if he was to be left on his own to find his way down to this planet called Pandora. But presently Ship spoke once more. Now we will dress you in appropriate costume, Raj. There is a new chaplain psychiatrist who rules the shipmen. They call him CP, and when he offends them, they call him the boss. You can expect that the boss will order you to attend him soon.
Perhaps the immobility of the things that surround us is forced upon them by our conviction that they are themselves and not anything else, and by the immobility of our conceptions of them. Marcel Proust, Ship Records. Oakes studied his own image reflected in the comm console at his elbow. The curved screen, he knew, was what made the reflection diminutive. Reduced. He felt jumpy. No telling what the ship might do to him next. Oakes swallowed in a dry throat. He did not know how long he had sat there hypnotized by that reflection. It was still nightside. An unfinished glass of Pandoran wine sat on a low brown table in front of him. He glanced up and around. His opulent cubby remained a place of shadows and low illumination, but something had changed. He could feel the change. Someone watching. The ship might refuse to talk to him, deny him elixir, but he was getting messages. Many messages. Change. That unspoken question which hovered in his mind had changed something in the air. His skin tingled, and there was a throbbing at his temples. What if the ship's program is running down? His reflection in the blank screen gave no answer. It showed only his own features, and he began to feel pride in what he saw there. Not just fat, no. Here was a mature man in his middle years. The boss. The silver at his temples spoke of dignity and importance. And although he was plump, his skin remained soft and clear, testimony to the care he took preserving the appearance of youth. Women liked that. What if the ship is truly God? The air felt dirty in his lungs, and he realized he was breathing much too rapidly. Doubts. The damned ship was not going to respond to his doubts. Never had. Wouldn't talk to him, wouldn't feed him. He had to feed himself from the ship's limited hydroponics gardens. How long could he continue to trust them? Not enough food for everyone. The very thought increased his appetite. He stared at the unfinished glass of wine, dark amber, oily on the inner surface of the glass. There was a wet puddle under the glass, a stain on the brown surface. I'm the CP. The CP was supposed to believe in Ship. In his own cynical way, old Kingston had insisted on this. I don't believe. Was that why a new CP was being sent groundside? Oakes ground his teeth together. I'll kill the bastard! He spoke it aloud, intensely aware of how the words echoed in his cubby. Hear that, Ship? I'll kill the bastard! Oakes half expected a response to this blasphemy. He knew this because he caught himself holding his breath, listening hard to the shadows at the edges of his cubby. How did you test for godhood?
How do you separate a powerful mechanical phenomenology, a trick of technological mirrors, from a miracle? If God did not play dice, as the CPs were always told, what might God play? Perhaps dice was not challenge enough for a god. What was risk enough to tempt a god out of silence or reverie, out of a god's lair? It was a stupefying question, to challenge God at God's own game. Oakes nodded to himself. In the game, perhaps, is the miracle. Miracle of consciousness? It was no trick to make a machine self-programming, self-perpetuating. Complex, true, and unimaginably costly. Not unimaginably, he cautioned himself. He shook his head to drive out the half-dream. If people did it, then it's imaginable, tangible, somehow explainable. Gods move in other circles. The question was, which circles? And if you could define those circles, their limits, you could know the limits of the god within them. What limits, then? He thought about energy. Energy remained a function of mass and speed. Even a god might have to be somewhere within the denominator of what kind of mass, how much, how fast. Maybe godhood is simply another expansion of limits. Because our vision dims is no reason to conclude that infinity lies beyond. Because our vision dims is no reason to conclude that infinity lies beyond. His training as a chaplain had always been subservient to his training as a scientist and medical man. He knew that to test data truly he could not close the doors on experiment, or assume that what he wished would necessarily be so. It was what you did with data, not the data, that was important. Every king, every emperor had to know that one. Even his theology master had agreed. Sell 'em on God. It's for their own good. Pin the little everyday miracles on God and you've got 'em. You don't need to move mountains. If you're good enough, people will move the mountains for you in the name of God. Ah, yes. That had been Edmund Kingston, a real chaplain psychiatrist out of the ship's oldest traditions, but still a cynic. Oakes heaved a deep sigh. Those had been quiet days shipside, days of tolerance and security of purpose. The machinery of the monster around them ran smoothly. God had been remote, and most shipmen remained in Hybe. But that had been before Pandora. Bad luck for old Kingston that the ship had put them in orbit around Pandora. Good old Edmund, dead on Pandora with the fourth settlement attempt. Not a trace recovered, not a cell. Gone now into whatever passed for eternity. And Morgan Oakes was the second cynical chaplain to take on the burden of ship. The first CP not chosen by the damned ship. Except there was this new CP, he reminded himself. This man without a name who was being sent groundside to talk to the damn vegetables, the electrokelp. He will not be my successor. There were many ways that a man in power could delay things to his own advantage. Even as I am now delaying the ship's request that we send this poet, what's-his-name, Peniel, groundside. Why did the ship want a poet groundside? Did that have anything to do with this new CP? A drop of sweat trickled into his right eye. Oakes grew aware that his breathing had become labored. Heart attack? He pushed himself off the low divan. Have to get help. There was pain all through his chest. Damn! He had had too many unfinished plans. He couldn't just go this way. Not now! He staggered to the hatch, but the hatch dogs refused to turn under his fingers. The air was cooler here, though, and he grew aware of a faint hissing from the equalizer valve over the hatch. Pressure difference? He did not understand how that could be. The ship controlled the interior environment. Everyone knew that. What are you doing, you damned mechanical monster? Oh, what are you doing, you damned mechanical monster? He whispered. Trying to kill me? It was getting easier to breathe. He pressed his head against the cool metal of the hatch, drew in several deep breaths. The pain in his chest receded. When he tried the hatch dogs again, they turned, but he did not open the hatch. He knew his symptoms could be explained by asphyxia or anxiety. Asphyxia? He opened the hatch and peered out into an empty corridor, the dim blue-violet illumination of nightside. Presently he closed the hatch and stared across his cubby. Another message from the ship? He would have to go groundside soon as Lewis made it safe for him down there. "Lewis, get that redoubt ready for us." Would the ship really kill him? No doubt it could. He would have to be very circumspect, very careful. And he would have to train a successor. Too many things unfinished to have them end with his own death. "I can't leave the choice of my successor to the ship." Even if it killed him, the damned ship could not be allowed to beat him. "It's been a long time. Maybe the ship's original program has run out." What if Pandora were the place for a What if Pandora were the place for a long winding down process? Kick the fledglings out of the nest a millimeter at a time. His gaze picked out details of the cubby. Erotic wall hangings, servo panels, the soft opulence of divans. Divans. Who will move in here after me? He had thought he might choose Lewis, provided Lewis worked out well. Lewis was bright enough for some dazzling lab work, but dull politically. A dedicated man. Dedicated? He's a weasel and he does what he's told. Oakes crossed to his favorite divan, fawn soft cushions. Cushions. He sat down and fluffed the cushions under the small of his back. What did he care about Lewis? This flesh that called itself Oakes would be long gone when the next chaplain took over. At the very least he would be in Hive, dependent on the systems of the ship. And it may not be a good idea to tempt Lewis with that much power, power that would be contingent upon Oakes's own death. After all, death was the specialty of Jesus Lewis.
No, no, Lewis had said to Oakes privately. It's not death. I give them life. I give them life. They're engineered clones, Doctor. E-clones. I remind you of that. If I give them life, for whatever purpose, it is mine to take away.
I don't want to hear it. He waved Lewis away with a brush of his hand.
Have it your way, Lewis said, but that doesn't change the facts. I do what I have to do, and I do it for you.
Yes, Lewis was a brilliant man. He had learned many new and useful genetic manipulation techniques from the genetics of the electrokelp, that most insidious indigent species on Pandora. And it had cost them dearly. A successor? What real choice would he make if he truly believed in the process and the godhood of ship? If he could exclude all the nastiness of politics? Legata Hamill. The name caught him off guard. It came so quickly. Almost as though he did not think it himself. Yes, it was true. He would choose Legata if he truly believed in ship. There was no reason why a woman could not be chaplain psychiatrist. No doubt of her diplomatic abilities. Some wag had once said that Legata could tell you to go to hell and make you anticipate the trip with joy. Oakes pushed aside the cushions and levered himself to his feet. The hatch out into the dim passages of Nightside beckoned him, that maze of mazes which meant life to them all, the ship. Had the ship really tried to asphyxiate him, or had that been an accident? I'll put myself through a med check first thing dayside. The hatch dogs felt cold under his fingers, much colder than just moments before. The oval closure swung soundlessly aside to reveal once more Nightside's blue-violet lighting in the corridor. Damn the ship! He strode out and, around the first corner, encountered the first few people of the behavioral watch. He ignored them. The behavioral complex was so familiar that he did not see it as he passed through. Biocomputer study, vitro lab, genetics, all were part of his daily routine and did not register on his nightside consciousness. Where tonight? He allowed his feet to find the way and realized belatedly that his wanderings were taking him farther and farther into the outlying regions, farther along the ship's confused twistings of passages and through mysterious hums and odd odors, farther out than he had ever wandered before. Oakes sensed that he was walking into a peculiar personal danger, but he could not stop even as his tensions mounted. The ship was able to kill him at any moment, anywhere shipside, but he took a special private knowledge with him. He was Morgan Oakes, C.P. His detractors might call him the boss, but he was the only person here, with the possible exception of Lewis, who understood there were things the ship would not do. Two of us among many. How many? They had no real census, shipside or groundside. The computers refused to function in this area, and attempts at manual counting varied so widely that they were useless. The ship showing its devious hand again. Just as the ship's machinations could be sensed in this order for a poet groundside. He remembered the full name now. Caro Peniel. Why should a poet be ordered groundside to study the kelp? If we could only eat the kelp without it driving us psychotic. Too many people to feed. Too many. Oakes guessed 10,000 shipside and 10 times that groundside, not counting the special clones, but no matter the numbers, he was the only person who realized how little knowledge his people had about the workings and purposes of the ship or its parts. His people. Oakes liked it that way. His people. Oakes liked it that way, recalling the cynical comment of his mentor, Edmund Kingston, who had been talking about the need to limit the awareness of the people. Appearing to know the unknown is almost as useful as actually knowing. From his own historical studies, Oakes knew that this had been a political watchword for many civilizations. This one thing stood out, even though the ship's records were not always clear, and he did not completely trust the ship's versions of history. It often was difficult to distinguish between real history and contrived fictions. But from the odd literary references and the incompatible datings of such works, from internal clues and his own inspired guesswork, Oakes deduced that other worlds and other people existed. Or had existed. The ship could have countless murders on its conscience. If it had a conscience. As I am your creation, you are mine. You are my satellites, and I am yours. Your personas are my impersonations. We melt into one at the touch of infinity. Raja Flattery, The Book of Ship. From the instant the Redoubt's first hatchway exploded, Jesus Lewis stayed within arm's length of his bodyguard, Illuyank. It was partly a conscious decision. Even in the worst of times, Illuyank inspired a certain confidence. He was a heavily muscled man, dark-skinned, with black wavy hair and a stone-cut face, accented by 3 blue chevrons tattooed above his left eyebrow. 3 chevrons. Illuyank had run outside around the colony. Illuyank had run outside around the colony perimeter 3 times, naked, armed only with his wits and endurance. Running the P for a bet or a date. Testing their luck, some called it. When the hatch blew, they all needed luck. Some of them were barely awake and had not yet eaten their first dayside meal. The clone's got a lasgun, Illuyank shouted. His clear, dark eyes worked the area. Dangerous. They don't know how to use it. The two men stood in a passage between the clones' quarters and a random huddle of survivors who waited behind them near a half circle of hatches leading to the core of the redoubt. Even in this moment of peril, Lewis knew how he must appear to the others. He was a short man, thin all the way. Thin, straw-colored hair, thin mouth, thin chin made even more so by a deep cleft, a thin nose, and oddly dark eyes which never seemed to reflect light in the thin compression of his lids. Beside him, Illuyank was everything Lewis was not. Both stared toward the core of the redoubt. There was a real question in their minds whether the core of the redoubt remained secure. Knowing this, Lewis had deactivated the communications pellet buried in the flesh of his neck and refused to answer it even when insistent calls from Oakes tempted him.
No telling who might be able to listen.
There had been some disquieting indications lately that their private communications channel might not be as private as he had hoped. By now, Oakes would have received word about the new CP. Discussion of that and the possible breach of their private communication system would have to wait. Oakes would have to be patient. At the first sign of trouble, Lewis had hit an emergency signal switch to alert Murdoch at Colony. There was no certainty, though, that the signal had gone through. He had not been allowed time for a retransmit check, and the whole redoubt had gone onto emergency power then. Lewis had no way of knowing which systems might be working and which not.
The damned clones!
A loud whirr sounded from the direction of the clones' quarters. Illuyank flattened himself on the floor, and the others were showered with shards of passage wall.
I thought they didn't know how to use that lasgun! Lewis shouted.
He pointed at a gaping hole in the wall as Illuyank leapt up and spun him around toward the others at the hatch circle. Down shaft! Illuyank called. One of the waiting group whirled the downshaft hatch dogs and opened the way into a passage lighted only by the blue flickering of emergency illumination. Lewis sprinted blindly behind Illuyank, heard the others scrambling after them. Illuyank shouted back at them as he ran. They don't know how to use it, and that's what makes it dangerous. Illuyank tucked and rolled across an open side passage as he spoke, firing a quick burst down the passage from his Gus gun. I think it's gush gun. They could hit anything anywhere. Or gas gun. Anyway, Lewis glanced down the open passage as he ran past, glimpsed a scattering of bodies blazing there. It soon became apparent where Illuyank was leading them, and Lewis admired the wisdom of it. They took a left turn into a new passage, then a right turn, and found themselves in the redoubt's unfinished back corridors, skirting the native rock of the cliffside into the small facilities room on the beach side. One plasma glass window overlooked the sea, the courtyard, and the corner where the clones' quarters joined the redoubt itself. The last of the followers dogged the hatch behind them. Lewis took quick stock of his personnel. 15 people, only 6 of them from his personally chosen crew. The others, rated reliable by Murdoch, had not yet been tested. Illuyank had moved to the maze of controls at the cliff wall and was poring over the redoubt schematics, etched into a master plate there. It occurred to Lewis then that Illuyank was the only survivor from Kingston's mission to this chunk of dirt and rock named Black Dragon. Sorry, let's try rereading that in a way that makes syntactical sense. It occurred to Lewis then that Illuyank was the only survivor from Kingston's mission to this chunk of dirt and rock named Black Dragon. That's the name of the chunk of black. That's not Illuyank's name. It's the chunk of dirt and rock's name. I can't read it properly right now. You'll just have to bear with. I apologize.
Is this how it was with Kingston? Lewis asked.
He forced his voice to an even calm while watching Illuyank trace a circuit with one stubby finger. Kingston cried and hid behind rocks while his people died. Runners got him. I cooked them out.
Cooked them out.
Lewis shuddered at the euphemism. The grotesque image of Kingston's head, crisped to char, grinned across his mind.
Tell us what to do.
Lewis was surprised at his control under this fear. Good. Illuyank looked directly at him for the first time. Good. Our weapons are these. He indicated the power switches and valve controls around them. We can control every circuit, gas and liquid from here. Lewis touched Illuyank's arm and pointed to a 1-meter square panel beside him. Yes. Illuyank hesitated.
We're blind otherwise, Lewis said.
For answer, Illuyank tapped out a code on the console beneath the square. The blank panel slid back to reveal 4 small view screens.
Sensors,
one of those behind them said.
Eyes and ears,
Lewis said, still looking at Illuyank. The dark man's expression did not change, but he whispered to Lewis, We also will have to see and hear what we do to them. Lewis swallowed and heard a faint snapping at the hatch.
They're cutting in,
a voice quavered behind them. Lewis and Illuyank scanned the screens. One showed the rubble that had been the clones' quarters. I'm hungry now! The new rallying cry of the clones was smeared in yellow grease across one wall. The adjoining screen scanned the courtyard. A crowd of mutated humans, E-clones all, scoured the grounds for rocks and bits of glass, anything for a weapon. Keep an eye on them, Illuyank whispered. They can't hurt us with that stuff, but all that blood out there will bring demons. There are holes all over our perimeter. If demons hit, they'll catch that bunch first. Lewis nodded. He could hear some of the others pressing close for a better view. Once more there was that snapping at the hatch. Lewis glanced at Illuyank. They're just pounding at us with rocks, Illuyank said. What we have to do is find that lasgun. Meanwhile, keep an eye on the courtyard. The blood. The lower left-hand screen showed the clone mess hall, a shambles of security hatches broken open in the background, a turmoil of clones throughout the area. This screen suddenly went blank.
Sensors gone in the mess hall, Lewis said.
Food will keep them busy there for a time, Illuyank said. He was busy searching through the redoubt on the remaining screen. It showed a flash of the courtyard from a different angle, then a broken tangle of perimeter wall, cut to pieces by the lasgun, or lasegun. It could go either way. Cut to pieces by the lasegun and swarming with clones coming from the outside where Lewis had ejected them, the action which had ignited this revolt.
We have to cull them somehow, Lewis told himself. The food will only go so far.
He turned his attention to the screen showing the courtyard. Yes, there was a lot of blood. It made him aware that he was badly cut himself. Cell tape stopped his major bleeding, but small cuts began to ache as he thought of his condition. None of them was without injury. Even Illuyank bled slightly from a rock cut above his ear. There, Illuyank said. His voice coincided with a new thump and crackling agitation at the hatch. But the COA screen Illuyank had been using now showed the passage outside their hatch. It was filled with a mass of clone flesh. Furred bodies, strange limbs, oddly shaped heads. At the hatch, 2 of the strongest clones were trying to maneuver a plasteel cutter, but their actions were impeded by the press of others behind them.
That'll get them in here for sure, someone said. We're cooked.
Illuyank turned and barked orders, pointing, waving a hand until all 15 were busy in the facilities room. A valve to control, a switch to throw. Each had some particular responsibility. Lewis keyed for sound in the screen, and a confused babble came over the speakers. Illuyank signaled to a man at the remote valve controls at the remote valve controls across the room. "Dump the brine tanks into level 2. That'll flood the outer passage." The man worked his controls, muttering as he followed the schematics at his position. Illuyank touched Lewis on the elbow, pointed to the screen which showed the courtyard. The clones there were looking away from the sensor, all of them at full alert, their attention on a broken segment of wall which led to the perimeter. Abruptly, almost as one organism, they dropped their rocks and glass weapons and ran screaming off screen. "Runners," Illuyank muttered. Lewis saw them, a waving swarm of tiny, pale worm shapes cresting the rubble. He could almost smell the burned acid and tasted acid in his throat. Automatically, he gave the orders. "Seal off." "We can't," a timid voice from the edge of the room began. "Some of our people are still out there. If we seal off, they'll all—" "They'll all die," Lewis finished for him, "and our perimeter's full of holes. Runners are in the courtyard. If we don't seal off, we die too. Seal off!" He crossed to a valve control panel, punched the proper sequence. Lights above the panel showed that the indicated valve was closing. He could hear others around him obeying. Illuyank's voice intruded with a quiet warning. "Check the surface shafts." This brought another bustle of activity. Lewis glanced at the courtyard screen. A clone stumbled back into the sensor's range, screaming and beating at his eyes with the blunt knobs which passed for his hands. As he moved into range, he fell and lay twisting on the ground. A blur of writhing shadows swept over him. The courtyard filled with fleeing clones and tiny, eel-like bodies. Behind Lewis, one of their group could be heard vomiting. "They're in the passage," Illuyank said. He gestured at the sensor where the view outside their hatch showed brine rising in the passage with a swarming mass of nerve runners riding in on the wave. Lewis shot a frantic glance at the hatch. What the sensor revealed was happening right out there. The brine stopped short of the passage ceiling, but not before it had shorted out the plasteel cutter. The plasteel cutter. It's not a cutter made of plasteel. It's a cutter of plasteel. It's a plasteel cutter, not a plasteel cutter. You see the difficulty. Clones were thrashing in the water, nerve runners covering them, but here and there dead runners could be seen on the brine's surface. And where the plasteel cutter had shorted out, a milky gray gas clouded the thin space over the water. Wherever the gas touched, runners died. Lewis felt his mind leaping from item to item. Item, brine. Item, electrical short. "Chlorine," he whispered. Then louder, "Chlorine! Chlorine!" "What?" Illuyank was clearly puzzled. Lewis pointed at the screen. "Chlorine kills nerve runners." "What's chlorine?" "A gas created when you throw an electrical charge through sodium chloride brine." "But—" "Chlorine kills runners." Lewis looked across the facilities room where the plasglass barrier showed a corner of clone area and the ocean beyond. "Are the sea pumps still working?" The man at the pump console checked his keyboard. Then, "Most of them." "Seawater wherever we can get it," Lewis said. "We need a large container where we can dump it from here and throw an electrical charge through it." "Water purification," Illuyank said. "The purification plant. We can pump almost everywhere from there."
"Wait a bit," Lewis said. "We want to attract as many runners as we can. Make them easier to wipe out."
He watched the screens, dragging it out. Then,
"All right, let's hit them."
once more, Illuyank scanned his schematics, throwing orders over his shoulder while the survivors in the facilities room obeyed. Lewis fixed his attention on the sensor screens. The outer passage was quiet now, a few dead E-clones floating on the surface of the brine, many dead runners among them. He tuned the mess room screen to another sensor eye, found the exercise bay outside the clone labs. It was filled with a thrashing crowd of E-clones in absolute panic, and, here and there among them, some of his own people caught outside when he had given the order to seal off. There were not many recognizable faces, but the colors of the uniforms could be identified. One by one they died, their mouths frothing pink, and their last stares turned upward toward the sensor. Even as the last of them lay dying, a milky cloud of gas had begun to sweep out of an open passage, drifting across the scene, blurring it.
"Watch their eyes," Illuyank said. "If we don't get all the runners, they'll go for the eyes first."
All was quiet in the facilities room then as the survivors listened to their own precious breath, felt the comfort of their own live sweat, and watched the eyes of the dead outside for some reflection of their own mortality. Lewis leaned against the lip of the console, feeling cold metal under his fingers. Other screens showed more of the milky gas billowing through the redoubt. There were even sensor eyes still alive to show the area outside the perimeter, their perimeter, the gas drifting across the open ground there. Illuyank scanned from sensor to sensor. Someone behind Lewis heaved a shuddering sigh, and Lewis echoed it.
"Chlorine,"
Illuyank muttered.
"We'll be able to sterilize the runner boils right out of existence now," Lewis said. "If we'd only known."
A nasty way to learn, someone behind them said. And someone else said, It'll be a long wait.
"Waiting's that way. Waiting's that way," Illuyank said. "Think how long you'll live if you're always waiting."
It was an insightful comment, deeper than anything Lewis had ever expected from Illuyank. And it meant that Illuyank would have to be shifted to a tour of duty colony side. He saw too much, deduced too much. That could not be permitted. First, though, they had to get out of here. But there was no way out except the runner-contaminated open areas of the redoubt. The chlorine would make that possible. In time.
"Can we get a message to Murdoch?"
Lewis asked.
"Emergency transmitter only,"
Illuyank said.
"Send him the emergency shutdown signal. No one comes in here until we've cleaned up. It wouldn't do to have anyone see what's happened and—"
Lewis directed a loaded look at Illuyank. Illuyank nodded and provided Lewis with a perfect opening for what had to be done.
"Someone should go colony side, though, and see that they understand." "That had better be you," Lewis said. "Make sure they don't try to explain anything to the boss shipside. That's my job."
Right.
"Don't tell them any more than you have to. And, while you're there, try to circulate in the colony everything normal, routine. Accept the usual assignments. Accept the usual assignments."
And try to find out if word of this, Illuyank glanced at the sensor screens, has leaked out.
"Good man."
And Lewis thought,
Too good.
Just as a technician learns to use his tools, you can be taught to use other people to create whatever you desire. This becomes more potent when you can create the special person for your special purpose.
Morgan Oakes, The Diaries. Legata Hamill knew that Groundside was to be their permanent home eventually, but she did not like these courier jobs on which Oakes sent her. There was a sense of power in them, though, no denying it. Her pass, often just an identifying look at her by a guard, admitted her anywhere. She was an arm of Morgan Oakes. She knew what they saw when they looked at her, A small woman with pale skin and ebon hair, a figure almost lush in its femininity. They saw a woman the boss wanted, and who, because of that, was powerful and dangerous. Every inspection trip she took for Oaks created tension. This time she was to inspect Lab 1 at Colony, and all of it would be on holo to make a full record for Oaks to review.
Penetrate it,
Oaks had said. The way he said penetrate had distinctly sexual overtones. She had never been into the Lab 1 depths before, and that alone piqued her curiosity. Lewis had a trusted minion there, Cy Murdoch. She was to meet Murdoch. Usually, Lewis was to be found in the tiny plasteel environs of the lab, which was entered via a triple lock system at the end of a long tunnel. Not today. Lewis was out of communication. A strange way of putting it, and there was no doubt that Oakes was disturbed by this development.
find out where the hell he is, what he's doing.
Both suns had been in the sky when the shuttle brought her down. Maximum flare security had been in force. She had been hustled out of the landing complex and into a servo which deposited her at the tunnel. The colony personnel were quick and harried today, rumors of perimeter difficulties with Pandora's many demons. Legata shuddered. Any thought of the predatory creatures which roamed the landscape beyond Colony's barriers filled her with apprehension. Murdoch himself met her in the brightly lighted and bustling area where the last lock sealed off the entrance within the lab. He was a blocky man, light complexion and blue eyes, with cropped brown hair. His fingers were short and stubby, the nails well trimmed. He always appeared recently scrubbed.
What is it this time?
He demanded. She liked the energy focus in his question. It said,
We're busy. We're busy here. What does Oaks want now?
very well, she could match that mood.
Where's Lewis?
Murdoch glanced around to see who might overhear them. Seeing no workers nearby, he said,
Redoubt. The redoubt.
Why doesn't he answer our calls?
Don't know.
What was his last message?
Emergency code. Hold all transports. No craft permitted to land at redoubt. Wait for a clearance signal.
Legata absorbed this. Emergency. What was happening across the waters at the redoubt?
Why wasn't Dr. Oakes informed?
The code signal called for complete security.
She understood this. No transmissions from colony to ship could carry a message involving that restriction. But that was 2 full Pandoran diurns ago. She sensed another restriction in the last message from the redoubt, a private Lewis restriction to his own minions. It would be pointless to explore such a conjecture, but she felt its presence.
Have you sent an overflight?
No.
So that was restricted too. Bad. Very bad. Well, then, she had to get on to the rest of her assignment.
I'm here to inspect the lab.
I know.
Murdoch had been studying this woman while they talked. The orders transmitted from the boss were clear. She was to go into everything except the scream room. Oh boy. We'll get there. We'll get there, and that is where things get really squicky. We'll get there. She was to go into everything except the scream room. That would come later for her, as it came for everyone here. She was a pretty thing, a pocket Venus with a doll face and green eyes. She had a good brain, too, by all accounts.
If you know, let's get going,
she said.
This way.
He led her down a passage between banked vats of primary clone wombs into the micro processing section. At first, Legata's interest was intellectual. She knew this, and it comforted her. Murdoch even took her hand at one point, leading her past rows of special application clone wombs. He was so intent in his rhapsody on equipment and techniques that she did not mind his touch. It was, after all, clinical. Or unintentional. Whichever, Murdoch's touch was not born out of affection. This she knew. But he knew Lab 1 as few others could, even perhaps as well as Lewis, and she had never been told to go deep into it before. "But I've accepted that as true," Murdoch was saying, and she had missed the point, being more intent on an incomplete fetus of odd proportions floating behind a screen of transparent plaz. She looked at Murdoch. "Accepted what? I'm sorry. I mean, there's so much to see." "Plasteel by the kilometer, tanks and fluids, pseudo-bodies, pseudo-minds." He waved his hand in frustration. She realized that Murdoch was in a particularly manic mood, and this bothered her. She felt the need to suppress unspoken questions about that odd fetus floating behind the screen of plasma glass. "So you've accepted all this," she said. "So what?" "We birth here. We conceive people here, nurture them fetally, extract them, send some shipside for training. Doesn't it strike you as odd we can't bring natural births groundside, too?" "What ship decides is for good reason, for the good of shipmen everywhere. I know, I've heard it as often as you have. But ship did not decide. Nowhere in the records can anyone, even you, the best search technician we have, so I'm told, find where ship has demanded that all births take place shipside. Nowhere." Without knowing how she knew it, Legata realized he was repeating Lewis's words verbatim. This was not Murdoch's manner of speaking. Why was she supposed to hear this? Was it part of Oakes's scheme to do away with the shipside obstetrics force, the Natali? Natali? They do natal work, so I'm going to keep calling them the Natali because I want to. If somebody has an official source that says how that's pronounced, please hit me up. Shoot me a message, leave a comment, whatever. "But we are required to worship," she said, "and what greater worship can we have than to entrust ship with our children? It makes sense, too." "Oh, it makes sense. It has logic," he agreed, "but it is not a direct command. And it makes a good deal of our work here in Lab 1 unnecessarily limited. Why, we could—" "Own this world? Morgan says you can do it anyway." There, let him chew on that. Morgan, not the boss, not Dr. Oakes. Murdoch dropped her hand, and the flush of elation washed out of his cheeks. "He knows we're on Holo," she thought, "and I've ruined his act." It occurred to her then that Murdoch had been playing to another audience, to Oakes. If the emergency at the redoubt over on Black Dragon turned out fatal for Lewis, yes, they would need a replacement. She imagined Oakes's attention on them later from some metallic scanner shipside. But she wanted Murdoch to squirm a bit more. She took his hand and said, "I'd like to see the garden." Her statement was only half true. She had seen the catalogues which Oakes kept securely locked away, the wide selection of E-clones grown to special purposes here. Any purpose, it seemed. Fewer than a dozen people shipside were even aware that such a process existed. And here at Colony, Lab 1 was a complex of its own, secreted away from the rest of the buildings, its purpose shrouded in the mystique of its name. Lab 1. When asked what went on at Lab 1, people usually said, "Ship only knows." Or they began some childish ghost story of hunchbacked scientists peering into the heart of life itself. Legata knew that Oakes and Lewis even encouraged the mystery, often started their own rumors. The result was a fearsome aura about the place, and recently there had been mutterings about the disproportionate supply of food allotted to Lab 1. To be assigned here, in the minds of shipmen and colonists alike, was to disappear forever. All workers moved into quarters at the complex and, with few exceptions, did not return shipside or to Colony proper. These thoughts left her with a feeling of unsettled doubts, and she had to remind herself, I'm not being assigned here. No, that wouldn't happen. Not as long as Oakes wanted to get her naked on his couch. To penetrate her. Legata took a deep breath of warm air. As in all colony buildings, temperature and humidity were identical with ships. Here in the lab, though, her flesh shuddered off a special kind of chill, a goose flesh that made her stomach ache and jabbed needles of pain into the knots that her nipples made against her single suit. She spoke quickly to mask her disquiet. Your staff people, they look so old. Many of them have been with us from the start. There was evasion in his voice, and it did not go unnoticed, but Legata chose to watch, not push. But they look even older than that. What? Murdoch interrupted her. We have a higher fatality rate than Colony. Did you know that? She shook her head. It was a lie. Had to be a lie. It's being out here on the perimeter, Murdoch said. We don't get the protection everyone else does. Nerve runners are particularly heavy this close to the hills. An uncontrollable shudder swept over her arms. Nerve runners. Those darting little worms were the most feared of all Pandoran creatures. They had an affinity for nerve cells, and would eat their way slowly, agonizingly along human nerve channels until they gorged on the brain, encysted, and reproduced. That's encysted, as in encysted, not the other kind not the homophone that sounds similar, but does not mean the same thing. Nerve runners are pretty nasty. Bad, Murdoch said, seeing her reaction. And the workload we carry here, of course, but that's agreed on from the start. These are the most dedicated people groundside. She looked across a bank of plasvats at a group of these dedicated workers. Blank, tight-lipped faces. Most of those she had seen here wrinkled and drawn, pale. Seen here were wrinkled and drawn, pale. No one joked. Not even a nervous giggle broke the monotony. All was the clink and click of instruments, the hum of tools, the aching distance between lives. Murdoch flashed her a sudden smile. But you wanted to see the garden. He turned, waved a hand for her to follow. This way. He led her through another system of locks, only doubles this time, into what appeared to be a training area for young E-clones. There were several of them around the entrance, but they drew back at Murdoch's approach. Fearful, Legata thought. There was a circular barrier across the training area, and she identified another lock entrance. What's over there? She nodded. We won't be able to go in there today, Murdoch said. We're sterilizing in there. Oh, what's in there? Well, that's the core of the garden. I call it the flower room. He turned toward a group of the young E-clones nearby. Now, here we have some of the young products from the flower room. Does your flower room have another name? She asked. She did not like his answers. Too evasive. He was lying. Murdoch turned to face her, and she felt threatened by the pouncing glee in his eyes. Guilty knowledge lay there. Dirty, guilty knowledge. Some call it the Scream Room, he said. Scream Room? And we can't go in there? Not today. Perhaps if you made an appointment for later? She controlled a shudder. The way he watched her, the avaricious glint to his eyes. I'll come back to see your flower room later, she said. Yes, you will. From you, Avada learns of a great poet-philosopher who said, "Until you meet an alien intelligence, you will not know what it is to be human." And Avada did not know what it was to be Avada. True and poetic. But poetry is what's lost in translation. Thus we now permit you to call this place Pandora, and to call us Avada. The first among you, though, called us vegetable. In this, Avada saw the deeper meaning of your history, and felt fear. You ingest vegetable to use the energy gathered by others. With you, the others end. With Avada, the others live. Avada uses minerals, uses rock, uses sea, uses the suns. And from all this, Avada nurtures life. With rock, Avada calms the sea and silences the turbulence inherited from the rip of suns and moons. Knowing human, Avada remembers all. It is best to remember, so Avada remembers. We eat our history, and it is not lost. We are one tongue and one mind. The storms of confusions cannot steal us from one another, cannot pry us from our grip to rock, to the firmament that cups the sea around us and washes us clean with its tides. With the tides. This is so because we make it so. We fill the sea and calm it with our body. The creatures of the water find sanctuary in Avada's shadow, feed in our light. They breathe the riches we exude. They fight among themselves for what we discard. They ignore us in their ravages, and we watch them grow, watch them flare in the sea like suns and disappear into the far side of night. The sea feeds us. It washes in and out, and we return to the sea in kind. Rock is Avada's strength, and as strength grows, so grows the nest. Rock is Avada's communion, ballast and blood. With all this, Avada orders quiet in the sea and subdues the fitful rages of the tides. Without Avada, the sea screams its fury in rock and ice. It whips the winds of hot madness. Without Avada, the rage of the sea returns to smother this globe in blackness and a thin white horizon of death. This is so because we make it so. Avada, barometer of life. Atom to molecule, molecule to chain, and chain winding around and around the magnificence of light, then cell to cell, and cell to blastula, cilia to tentacle, and from stillness blossoms the motion of life. Avata harvests the mysterious gas of the sea, and is born into the world of clouds and mountains, into the world the stars walk in fear. Avata sails high with the gas from the sea to find the country of the spark of life. There Avata gives self to love, thence back to the sea, and the circle is complete but unfinished. Avata feeds and is fed. Sheltered, Avata shelters, eats and is eaten, loves and is loved. Growth is the Avata way. In growth is life. As death resides in stillness, Avata strives for stillness in growth, a balance of flux, and Avata lives. This is so because Avata makes it so. If you know this of the alien intelligence and still find it alien, you do not know what it is to be human. Caro Panil. Translations from the Avata. You are called Project Consciousness, but your true goal is to explore beyond the imprinted pattern of all humankind. Inevitably, you must ask, is consciousness only a special kind of hallucination? Do you raise consciousness or lower its threshold? The danger in the latter course is that you bring up the military analog. You are confined to action. Original charge to the void ship chaplain psychiatrist. On these night-side walks through the ship, Oakes liked to move without purpose, without the persona of CP tagging along. He had worked long and hard to remain just a name both shipside and groundside. Few saw his face, and most of his official duties were carried out by minions. There was the routine worship in the corridor chapels, the food allotments groundside, a minimal endorsement of the many functions that the ship carried out with no human intervention. CP rule was supposed to be nominal, but he wanted more. Kingston had once said, "We have too damn much idle time. We're idle hands, and we can get into trouble." Memories of Kingston were much with Oakes this night as he took his nocturnal prowl. Through the outer passages, sensor eyes and ears dotted corridor walls and ceilings. They strung themselves ahead and behind in diminishing vectors of attention, dim glistenings in the blue-violet nightside lighting. Still no word from Lewis. This rankled. Legata's preliminary report left too many unanswered questions. Was Lewis striking out on his own? Impossible. Lewis did not have the guts for such a move. He was the eternal behind-the-scenes operator, not a front man. What was the emergency, then? Oakes felt that too many things were coming to a head around him. They could not delay much longer on sending this poet, this Caro Panil, groundside. And the new CP the ship had brought out of Hybe. Both poet and CP would have to be bundled into the same package and watched carefully. And it would soon be time to start an eradication project against the kelp. People were getting hungry enough groundside that they were ready for scapegoats. And that disturbing incident with the air in his cubby. Had the ship really tried to asphyxiate him? Or poison him? Oakes turned a corner and found himself in a long corridor with iridescent green arrows on the walls indicating that it led outward from ship center. The ceiling sensors were dots receding into a converging distance. Out of habit, he noticed the activation of each sensor as he neared it. Each mechanical eye followed his pace faithfully, and as he approached the limits of its vision, the next one rolled its wary cyclopean pupil around to catch his approach. He had to admit that, in shipman or machine, he appreciated this sense of guarded watchfulness, but the idea that a possibly malevolent intelligence waited behind that movement set his nerves on edge. He had never known a sensor to malfunction. To tamper with one meant dealing with a robox unit, a single-minded repair and defense device that respected no life or limb save that of ship. The ship, damn it! Those years of programming, preparation, even he could not shake them. How did he expect others of lesser will, lesser intelligence, to do so? He sighed. He expected to sway no one. What he expected was that he would use the tools at hand. With intelligence, he felt that one could turn anything to advantage, even a dangerous tool such as Lewis. Another pair of sensors caught his attention, this time outside the access to the docking bays. It was quiet here and pervaded by that odd smell compounded from uncounted sleeping people. Not even freight moved during Colony's nightside, which sometimes coincided with ship time, but often did not. All the industry of dayside was put away for the community of sleep. Except in two places, he reminded himself. Life support and the agraria. Oakes stopped and studied the line of sensors. He, of all shipmen, should appreciate them. He had access to the movements they recorded. Every detail of shipside life was supposed to be his, and he had seen to it that the groundside colony was similarly equipped. Ship's watchfulness was his own. The more we know, the stronger we are in our choices. Kingston's voice came to him from his training days. What a raw and marvel, but what a raw but marvelously trainable bit of human material I was. Kingston had been almost a master of control. Almost. And control was a function of strong choices. When it came down to it, Kingston had refused certain choices.
I do not refuse.
Choices resulted from information. He had learned that lesson well.
But how can you know the result of every choice?
Oakes shook his head and resumed his wandering. The sense that he walked into new dangers was an acute pressure in his breast. But there was no stopping this, short of death. His feet turned him down a passageway which he saw led to an agrarium. There was a there was the pe- There was the peculiar green smell of the passage, even if he had not recognized the wide cart tracks leading through an automatic lock ahead. He stepped across the track dump, through the lock, and found himself in a dimly lighted and frighteningly unbounded space. It was nightside here, too. Even plants required that diurnal pulse. An internally illuminated yellow wall map at his left showed him his location and the best access routes out. It also showed this agrarium. The largest extrusions of the ship were monopolized for food production, but he had not entered one of those complexes for years, not since provisioning that first attempted colony on Pandora's Black Dragon continent, long before they had gained their colony foothold on the egg.
Kingston's first big mistake.
Oakes stepped closer to the map, aware of distant movement far out in the agrarium, but more interested in this symbol. He was not prepared for what the map told him. The agrarium he had entered was almost as large as the central core of the ship. It spread out, fan-like, from roots in the original hull. Ship and colony maintenance figures he had been initialing took on a new reality here, and the map's explanatory footnote was an exclamation point. As Oakes looked on, the nightside shift of agrarium workers broke for their mid-meal warship. They did so as one, and no perceptible signal passed among them, no reluctance of any sort evident. They moved together into the dim blue light of the warship alcove.
They believe, Oakes thought. They really believe that the ship is God.
As the ship's supervisor led them in their litany, Oakes found himself washed in a sadness that came so suddenly and so hard that it held him on the verge of tears. He realized then that he envied them their faith, their small comfort of the ritual that was so much bother to him. The supervisor, a squat, bow-legged man with dirt on his hands and knees, led them in the chant of sure growth. "Behold the bed of dirt!" And he dropped a pinch of dirt to the floor. "And the seed asleep in it," the crew responded, lifting their bowls and setting them down. "Behold water!" He dribbled some from his glass. "And the waking it brings." They raised their glasses. "Behold light!" He lifted his face to the UV racks overhead. "And the life it opens." They spread their hands, palms up. "Behold the fullness of the grain, the thickness of the leaf." He spooned from the communal pot into the bowl to his left. "And the seed of life it plants in us." Each worker spooned a helping for the shipman on his left. "Behold ship, and the food ship gives." Excuse me. The supervisor sat down. "And the joy of company to share it," they said, and sat to eat. Oakes turned away unnoticed.
The joy of company,
He snorted to himself. If there were less company and more food, there would be a damn sight more joy. He moved along the rim of the ship's outer hull then, raw space only a few meters away. His mind was racing. That agrarium could feed 30,000 people. Instead of counting people, they could count agraria and add the support figures. He knew that groundside shipments supplied 80% of colony stores. Here was a key to real numbers. Why had they not seen that before? Even as he experienced elation at this thought, Oakes knew the ship would frustrate such an attempt. The damned ship did not want them to know how many people it supported. It blocked their attempts to count. It hid hive complexes and confused you with meaningless corridors. It brought a nameless CP out of hive and announced a new groundside project outside of shipman control. Well, accidents could happen groundside, too. And even a precious CP from ship could walk into a fatality. What difference did it make? The new CP was probably a clone. Oakes had seen the earliest records. Clones were property. Somebody who signed with the initials MH had said it. And there was an aura of power about that statement. Clones were property. Metaphysics, genetic manipulation, and slavery? Goodness gracious, this book has it all.
A word of caution about our genetic programs. When we breed for speed, we breed as well for very specific kinds of decisions. Speed chops out, edits out certain kinds of reflexive choices and long-term considerations. Everything becomes the decision of the moment.
Jesus Lewis, The E-Clone Directive. When temporary seals had closed off the breaks in the perimeter of the redoubt, Lewis directed the careful dayside cleanup of the interior. It was a long, frustrating job, and they worked through the night with emergency lighting. The entire redoubt stank of chlorine, so strong in some areas that they were forced to wear filters and portable breathing equipment. In the morning, they drenched the courtyard with chlorine several times before daring to touch the corpses there. Even then, they moved the bodies with hastily improvised claw grabs attached to mobile equipment. Chlorine everywhere, and the inevitable burns of both flesh and fabrics made it an even slower task. At Sub-Level 4, they came on a welcome surprise. 29 clones and 5 more of the Redoubt crew sealed in an unlighted storage chamber, all of them hungry, thirsty, and terrified. The chamber contained spare charges for the gush guns, permitting Lewis to add fire to the chlorine for a final sterilization sweep. Lewis was surprised to find that the E-clones had not attacked the 5 crewmen. Then he learned that the crewmen had sounded the alarm at the Nerve Runner attack and herded the clones into the chamber. A sense of fellowship between E-clones and normals had developed during the long confinement. Lewis noted it as they emerged, clones helping normals and vice versa. Very dangerous, that. He gave sharp orders to separate them, clones to the more dangerous task of courtyard cleanup, normals to their regular supervisory tasks. So another thing this book deals with is power dynamics, maintenance thereof, influence thereof, and the levers thereof. One observation particularly annoyed him: the sight of a trusted guard, Patterson, being solicitous over a delicate female E-clone of the new mix. She was tall and emaciated by human standards, a light brown skin and large eyes. Her whole series was flawed by fragile bones, and Lewis had almost decided to abandon it, except that now she was one of the few remaining examples of the genetic mix between human and Pandoran. Perhaps Patterson was merely being careful with valuable material. He must know how fragile the bones of this series were. Yes, that could be it. Lewis was pleased to note other, more successful examples of the new E-clones, the breed incorporating native genetic material. There would be no need to go back through that long, slow, and costly development program. The disaster here at the Redoubt had not been total. A mood of euphoria came over him as it became increasingly clear that they had sterilized the Redoubt, and that they had a new weapon effective against runners.
At least we've solved the food problem, he told Illuyank.
Illuyank gave him a strange, measuring look which Lewis did not like.
Counting E-clones, there are only 50 of us left, Illuyank said. But we've saved the heart of the project, Lewis said.
Too late, Lewis realized he had said too much to this perceptive aide. Illuyank had proved himself capable of making correct deductions on limited information.
Well, Illuyank was going colony side. Murdoch would see to things there.
We'll need replacements, lots of them, Illuyank persisted.
I expect us to be stronger because of this testing, Lewis said.
Lewis diverted Illuyank by ordering a complete inspection of the redoubt. Every corner, every bay, no space missed. Chlorine and or fire everywhere. They moved slowly through the passages and across the open areas, their progress marked by the hissing flames of the gush guns and great splashing washes of chlorine. Lewis ordered a final purging with chlorine gas, opening all valves, all hatches within the redoubt. They then made another inspection with sensor eyes. Clean. When it was finished, they pumped the chlorine residue onto the surrounding ground, followed it by waves of gas which swept around the rocks and hillocks where the clones had huddled when he had ordered them thrust from the safety of the redoubt. Inevitably, some of the chlorine spilled over the cliff into the sea. It ignited a violent, churning retreat by the hallucinogenic kelp in the cove. A pack of highlighters came to the excitement. They floated at a safe distance over the surrounding hills, spectators, while Lewis and his meager force sterilized the area around the redoubt. Later, Lewis went grinding out of a lock in an armored vehicle to direct the outside sterilizing team, taking Illuyank as his driver. At one point, Lewis ordered Illuyank to stop and shut down while they studied the arc of highlighters in the distance. It was a scene framed by the thick barrier of plasglass in the crawler. The giant orange bags floated in disconcerting silence, anchored by long black tendrils twining in the rocks of the hills. They were a perimeter of mystery about 3 kilometers distant, and they filled Lewis with angry fear.
We'll have to eliminate those damned things, he said. They're floating bombs.
And maybe more, Illuyank said. One of the surviving clones took this moment to drop his chlorine backpack. The clone turned to face the arc of highlighters, spread his stumpy arms wide, and called out in a voice heard through the area, Avata! Avata! Avata!
Get that damned fool out of here and into confinement, Lewis ordered.
Illuyank relayed the order over their vehicle's external speakers. 2 supervisors scrambled to obey. Lewis watched in grumbling impatience. Avata. That had been the other cry of the clone revolt. Avata and "We're hungry now." If the particular clone out there had not been one of the precious new ones with the genetic mix, Lewis knew he would have ordered the stupid creature killed immediately. New security precautions would have to be put into effect, he told himself. Tougher rules about clone behavior. Oaks would have to be brought into these decisions. They would have to raid Colony and ship for replacements. More clones, more staff, more guards, more supervisors. Murdoch and the Scream Room were going to be very busy for a time. Very busy. Well, gardening had always been a brutal business. Root out the weeds, kill off the predatory grazers, destroy the pests. Lab 1's special purpose area was correctly labeled the garden, producing flowers for Pandora.
We've used up the chlorine and it looks clean out here, Illuyank said. Take us back inside, Lewis ordered. Then, when you get back to Colony, I don't want any mention of the chlorine.
Right. Lewis nodded to himself. It was time now to consider what he would tell Oaks, how this disaster would be explained to make it an important victory.
Clones are property, and that's that.
Morgan Hempstead, Moonbase Director. Oh, geez, I just got lost.
Thank you for complying with my invitation.
Thomas watched the seated speaker carefully, wondering at the sense of peril aroused by such a simple statement. This was Morgan Oakes, chaplain psychiatrist? The CP, the boss? It was late dayside on ship, and Thomas had not been long enough from Hybe to feel completely awake and familiar with his long dormant flesh. I am no longer Raja Flattery. I am Raja Thomas. There could be no slip in the new facade, especially here.
I've been studying your dossier, Raja Thomas,
Oakes said. Thomas nodded. That was a lie. The stress in the man's voice was obvious. Didn't Oakes realize how much he betrayed himself to trained senses? You could not believe a word this man uttered. He was careless. That was it. Perhaps there are no other trained senses to test him. I responded to a summons, not an invitation, Thomas said. There, that was the kind of thing a Raja Thomas would say. Oakes merely smiled and tapped a folder of thin ship paper in his lap. A dossier? Hardly. Thomas knew that it was in Ship's interest to conceal the real identity of this new player in the game. Thomas. I am Thomas. He glanced around the ship cell to which Oakes had invited him, realizing belatedly that this once had been a cubby. Oakes had taken out bulkheads to expand the cubby. Then, as Thomas recognized a mystical decorative motif between two dark red woven wall hangings, he suffered one of the worst shocks in this awakening. This was my cubby. It was obvious that Ship had expanded enormously since those faraway void ship days, when it had housed only a few thousand hibernating humans and a minimal umbilicus crew. The changes he had seen on the trip here from hibernation hinted at even deeper changes behind them. What had happened to Ship? This expanded cubby suggested an unsavory history. The space was sybaritic with exotic hangings, deep orange carpeting, soft divans. Except for a small hollow projection at Oakes's left hand, all the cubby's expected servo systems had been concealed. Oakes was giving his visitor plenty of time to study the space around him, using the time to return that scrutiny. What was Ship's intent with this mysterious newcomer? The question was engraved large on Oakes's face. Thomas found his own attention caught by the computer-driven projection at the holofocus. It was a familiar three-dimensional analog of a ship orbiting a planet, all glittering green and orange and black. Only the planetary system was unfamiliar. It had 2 suns and several moons. As he watched the slow progression of the ship's orbit, he felt an odd sense of déjà vu. He was in motion, in a ship in motion, in a universe in motion, and it had all happened before. Replay? Ship said not, but Thomas shrugged off such doubts, reserving them for later. He did not have to be told that the planet in the focus was Pandora, and that this projection represented a real-time version of Ship's position in the system. Some things did not change no matter the great passage of time. Bickle had once monitored such a projection on the void ship Earthling. Morgan Oakes sat on a deep divan of rust velvet while Raja Thomas stood, an unsubtle accent on their positions in a hierarchy which Thomas had not yet analyzed.
I'm told you are a chaplain psychiatrist,
Oakes said, and he thought,
this man does not respond to his name in a quite normal way.
That was my training, yes.
Expert in communication?
Thomas shrugged.
Ah, yes.
Oakes was pleased with himself.
That remains to be tested. Tell me why you have asked for the poet.
Ship asked for the poet. So you say.
Oakes allowed the silence to follow this challenge. Thomas studied the man. Oakes was portly going on fat, dark complexion, faint odor of perfume. His gray-streaked hair had been combed forward to conceal a receding hairline. The nose was sharp and flared at the nostrils, the mouth thin and given to a tight, stretching grimace. The chin was wide and cleft. The man's eyes dominated this rather common shipman face. They were light blue, and they probed, boring in, always trying to penetrate every surface they found. Thomas had seen such eyes on people diagnosed as psychotic. Wow. Other than the particularly dark complexion, guy sounds kind of familiar, except in a different way. Hmm. Never mind. I think I've seen that guy before.
Do you like what you see?
Oakes asked. Again, Thomas shrugged. Oakes did not like this response.
What is it you see in me which requires such scrutiny?
Thomas stared at the man. The genotype was recognizable, and that first name was suggestive. Oakes could have Lon as a middle name. If Oakes were a clone instead of a replay survivor rescued from a dying planet, yes, that would be an interesting clue as to how Ship was playing this deadly game. Oakes bore a more than casual resemblance to Morgan Hempstead, the long-ago director of Moonbase. And there was that first name. I've just been very curious to meet the boss, Thomas said. He found a seat facing Oakes and sat without invitation. Oakes scowled. He knew what they called him shipside and groundside, but politeness, not to mention politics, dictated that the term not be used in this room. Best not precipitate conflict yet, however. This Raja Thomas posed too many mysteries. Aristocratic type, that damned better-than-you manner.
I, too, am curious,
Oakes said. I'm a servant of Ship.
But what is it you're supposed to do?
I was told you have a communications problem on Pandora, something about an alien intelligence.
How very interesting. What are your special capabilities in this respect?
Ship appears to think I'm the one for the job.
I don't call the ship's process thinking. Besides, who cares what opinions come out of a system of electronic bits and pieces? I prefer a human assessment.
Oakes watched Thomas carefully for a response to this open blasphemy. Who was this man, really? You couldn't trust the damned Ship to play fair. The only thing to believe was that the Ship was not a god. Powerful, yes, but with limits which needed exploring. Well, I intended to have a go at the problem, Thomas said.
If I permit it.
That's between you and Ship, Thomas said. I'm well satisfied to carry out Ship's suggestions.
It offends me,
Oakes paused, leaned back into his cushions,
when you refer to this mechanical construction.
He waved a hand to indicate the physical presence of Ship all around.
As Ship, the implications.
He left it there. Have you issued an order prohibiting worship? Thomas asked. He found this an interesting prospect. Would Ship interfere?
I have my own accommodation with this physical monstrosity which human hands loosed on the universe,
Oakes said.
We tolerate each other. You have an interesting first name, do you know that?
In my family for a very long time.
You have a family?
Had a family, would be more proper.
Strange. I took you for a clone.
That's an interesting philosophical question, Thomas said. Do clones have families?
Are you a clone?
What difference does that make?
No matter. As far as I'm concerned, you're another machination of the Ship. I will tolerate you. For now.
He waved a hand in dismissal. Thomas was not ready to leave. You, too, have an interesting first name. Oakes had been turning toward the holo projection and its comm console at his side. He hesitated, glanced at Thomas without turning his head.
The gesture said, "You still here?" But there was more in his eyes. His interest had been caught. "Well?" "You bear a striking physical resemblance to Morgan Hempstead, and I couldn't help but notice that you have the same first name." "Who was Morgan Hempstead?"
We often wondered if the Moon-Base director had allowed a clone of himself. Are you that clone?"
"I'm not a clone. And what the hell is Moonbase?"
Thomas broke off, recalling what Ship had told him. These replay survivors had been picked up at a different stage in human development. The resemblance, even the name, could be a coincidence. Did they come from a time before space travel? Was Ship their first experience in the many dimensions of the universe?
"I asked you a question!"
Oakes was angry and not bothering to conceal it. Moonbase was the project center which created Ship.
"On Earth's moon? My Earth?"
Oakes touched his breast with a thumb, and he thought about this revelation. Didn't you ever wonder where Ship originated? Thomas asked.
"Many times, but I never thought we did this thing to ourselves."
Thomas remembered more of Ship's recital now and drew on it. Some people had to be saved. The sun was going nova. It required a Herculean effort.
"So we were told," Oakes said, "but that was later. I'm considerably more interested in how a moon base was kept secret."
If there's only one lifeboat, do you tell everyone where it is? Thomas felt rather proud of this creative lie. It was just the kind of thing Oakes might believe. Oakes nodded to himself.
"Yes, of course."
He glanced at the comm console, then twisted himself more comfortably into the divan. Thomas was lying, obviously. Interesting lie, though. Everyone knew that the ship had landed in Egypt. Egypt? Could there be two ships? Perhaps. And there could have been many landings. Thomas stood. Where do I find transportation down to Pandora?
"You don't. Not until you've told me more about Moonbase. Make yourself comfortable."
He indicated the seat which Thomas had vacated. There was no avoiding the threat. Thomas sank back. What a tangled web we weave, he thought. Truth is easier. Easier. But Oakes could not be told the truth. No, not yet. The proper moment and place had to be found for laying Ship's command upon him. Shipmen were far gone in the puny play of warship. They would have to be shaken out of that before they could even contemplate Ship's real demand. Thomas closed his eyes and thought for a moment, then opened his eyes and began recounting the physical facts of Moonbase as he knew them. The account was barbered only to the extent needed for illusion that Moonbase had been a project kept secret from Oakes's Earth. Occasionally, Oakes stopped him, pressing for particular details.
"You were clones? All of you?"
Yes. Oakes could not conceal his delight at this revelation.
"Why?"
Some of us were sure to be lost. Cloning was a way of improving the project's chances of success. The best people were selected. Each group had more data.
"That's the only reason?"
Moon-based directives defined clones as property. You could do things to clones that you couldn't do to natural natals, the naturally born humans. Oakes ruminated on this for a moment while a slow smile crept over his face. Then,
"Do continue."
Thomas obeyed, wondering what it was that Oakes found so satisfying. Presently, Oakes raised a hand to stop the recital. Small details were not of pressing interest. The broad picture carried the messages he wanted. Clones were property. There was precedent for this, and now he knew the name behind those significant initials. M.H. Morgan Hempstead. He decided to press for any other weaknesses in this Raja Thomas.
"You say Raja is a family name. Are you, related to the Raja Flattery mentioned in what passes for our history?"
Distantly. Already he felt himself firm. Oh, and Thomas thought, That's true. We're related distantly in time. Once there was a man called Raja Flattery, but that was another eon. Already he felt himself firmly seated in the identity of Raja Thomas. In some ways the role suited him better than that of Flattery. I was always the doubter. My failures were failures of doubt. I may be ship's living challenge, but the means are mine. Oakes cleared his throat. I found this a most edifying and gratifying exchange. Once more Thomas stood. He did not like this man's attitude, the feeling that people were only valuable in terms of their usefulness to Morgan Oakes. Morgan. He has to be a Hempstead clone. Has to be. I'll be leaving now, Thomas said. Was that challenge enough? He studied Oakes for a negative response. Oakes was merely amused. Yes, Raja Lawn Thomas. Go. Pandora will welcome you. Perhaps you'll survive that welcome. For a time. Not until much later, when he was standing in the ship bay waiting to board the groundside lighter, did Thomas pause to wonder at where and how Oakes had obtained those sybaritic furnishings for his expanded cubby. From ship? And that's where we will leave it for today. I've got to run. I am tapped out. Also, that's where I had planned to get to last week, so we're good. Anyway, I think it's becoming. Things just keep getting more interesting. It's a really fascinating book. I highly recommend it. Definitely try and get yourself a copy. I hope it's still in print. It should be. It's worth getting in any case. Um, it's also why I'm incredibly thankful to the person who asked it be done, because I was like, that'd be great. And it gave me a great excuse to reread the series and was like, oh yeah, this is great. This is even better than I remembered, brah. And it really is good. So anyway, I'm going to leave it there. I will see you all next week, where we'll be reading through more of Manfac on Monday by Martin Caden, the last bit of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, and more of The Jesus Incident by Frank Herbert and Bill Ransom. As always, though, stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. See you all next time. Toodaloo!